The year is 2005, and F1 has changed its regulations once again, mainly to directly hinder Ferrari, as this was actually done back then, but anyway. Ferrari weren't off to the best of starts in 2005, with the likes of Renault, McLaren and even BAR Honda getting the better of them throughout the first few rounds. A lot of this comes from the fact that the Michelin rubber was far superior to the Bridgestone rubber, mostly, and being that Ferrari, Minardi and Jordan were the only teams that ran with the Bridgestones, that would make Ferrari fall away from domination, and basically into the midfield. And the likes of Minardi and Jordan saw their already losing battle become even harder. The new boys to beat appeared to be Renault in this new set of regulations, as this exact set would only last a singular season, with Giancarlo Fisichella and, more importantly, Fernando Alonso winning the first 3 races between them, leaving Fernando on 26 points going into the San Marino Grand Prix. He would already be 24 points ahead of Michael, who had only managed a 7th and 2 DNFs in the beginning rounds. So he and the Scuderia would have some work to do as they went into San Marino. Using the very brief, unpopular qualifying format known as aggregate qualifying, the Ferraris continued to show how mid they had turned out to be at the start of the season, with Barrichello in 10th and Schumacher lower still in 14th, after a mistake on one of his 2 qualifying laps. Needless to say, a far cry from the all-dominating F2004. This would be further compounded by the fact that Imola is Imola, especially with these regulations and the fact that the Variante Bassa was still present, unlike today. Overtaking would be extremely difficult. McLaren and Renault would flex their pace once again, with Kimi starting on pole alongside Fernando. However, neither would be able to rely on backup from their teammates, at least at the start, as Fisichella had a mare down in 13th, and Alex Wurz, well, he was substituting for an injured Juan Pablo Montoya that broke his wrist in a motocross accident. I mean, playing tennis. Maybe both, who knows. Up until lap 9, it looked like it would have been a relative walk in the park for the McLaren MP420 of Kimi Raikkonen. Bolting away at the start, he would extend his gap to Fernando Alonso, that also held position at the start, comfortably the best part of 3/4 of a second quicker than the Renault in the early stages. This was compounded by the fact that Fernando would definitely have no backup from his teammate Giancarlo, as he threw his R25 into the wall on lap 5 through Tamburello. What was a promising start to the season for Fisichella was now firmly in the mud, although it has to be said, I don't think this particular accident was his fault, as for a car that has traction control to spin like that is very unusual. But the Achilles heel of the McLaren would strike in the form of its poor reliability. This would be a theme throughout 2005, but it would strike Kimi and take him out of the race effective immediately, leaving Fernando Alonso in the lead with a more than manageable gap over the BAR Honda of Jenson Button. Michael at this point would be stuck behind a gaggle of cars in what is commonly known as the Trulli train. Known for being rapid in qualifying, but a lot of the time less than stellar in race trim. Because of his fuel load, remember this was back in the days of refueling, he was able to overcut the rest of the cars in this train, smashing 2 extremely fast laps in when the road became free, jumping basically everyone in that train. He would emerge in 4th, behind an impressive Alex Wurz in the McLaren. It would be in the second stint that Schumacher's pace would become evident, and for the first time in 2005, and arguably the only time in 2005, the car, driver and circuit would all click and deliver a crushing pace, giving all F1 fans PTSD back to the year previously with the F2004, being 2 seconds a lap quicker than either Button or Alonso at the beginning of this particular stint. Fernando's job at this point would just be to survive. There would be no way that Michael wouldn't catch him before the end of the race if Jenson didn't provide a fight, which, thanks to lapped Williams, he didn't, and Michael dove past the BAR at the Variante Alta. The only way that Fernando would be able to fend off the Ferrari for as long as possible would be to pit earlier, for what would be his 3rd and final stint throughout the Grand Prix. Everyone would fill up with fuel twice throughout, FYI. So essentially everyone was just on the same strategy, near enough. Just a quick side note though. The reason as to why the Bridgestones were particularly poor in 2005 in terms of raw pace was because of the fact that in 2005, there were no tyre changes permitted throughout a Grand Prix. which nowadays seems absolutely inane. But yeah, those were the rules. As a result, Michelin and Bridgestone would have to create tyres that would essentially last entire race weekends. Safe to say that Michelin really got the one-up over Bridgestone. When you look at the average finishing positions across the different tyre manufacturers, oh yeah, apart from that one race, Jensen would briefly lead the Grand Prix as a result of Fernando's early pit stop to try and fend off the bigger threat in Michael Schumacher, of whom would go slightly longer once again, and when he did come in, he was noticeably closer to the Renault. Like an elephant slowly edging its way into a room without a Grand Prix, it had now broken the door off the hinges. As from what was almost a 20-second deficit to Fernando at the beginning of the second stint, with 12 laps to go, the Red Baron would now be right underneath the rear wing of the blue and yellow Renault. However, remember how I said earlier that because of the new 2005 regulations, that overtaking with this generation of F1 car was particularly difficult? Yeah, that would come into full force in this battle, alongside the masterclass in defensive driving from Fernando Alonso. But there were a number of occasions where Michael would get half alongside the Renault, before having to back off before he was either just closed down or just in a bad spot. Because of how we know Imola, the number one overtaking spot is into turn 1 at the chicane of Tamburello, as it is full throttle all the way from the Ravazza, allowing drivers to get enough momentum along with DRS to get past. However, these guys didn't have DRS, they didn't have hybrid power, as well as the fact the Variante Bassa was still present, as I mentioned earlier, a left-right chicane just before the start-finish line, which serves to break up the cars even further, as there's absolutely no way two cars would go through here side by side. The torque of the Renault engine was also a big factor in keeping Fernando ahead, as even though the Renault across the whole lap was clearly slower, it was fast enough in all the right places so we could keep the Ferrari at bay, most notably into the braking zones. And with how strict the nature of Imola is in terms of taking different lines, it proved to be challenging for Michael to dummy, show the nose, set up moves a couple corners in advance, as the speed of the Ferrari mid-corner was so much faster than what the Renault was able to produce, being an understeery car in general. I mean, just look at some of Fernando's onboards of him driving it. This battle, in my honest opinion, may well be the greatest in F1 history. It is the perfect example of catching someone and passing someone are two very different things. And even with a 2-second advantage, he wasn't able to pass. Then on top of that, you had the soundtrack of the V10, creating this extraordinarily intense atmosphere around the circuit, with the Tifosi rising to their feet every time the duo blasted past. This screenshot from the broadcast of Fernando looking in his mirror as he goes down to turn 1 with Michael right underneath his rear wing, almost looking over his shoulder. Absolutely iconic image for an iconic race. Michael would have one last shot of Fernando going into Tosa on the final lap, with the Renault managing just to hold on around the outside. But don't get me wrong, the R25 was agonisingly slow in some of these corners. Michael would lock up going into the Variante Bassa for the last time, more out of sheer desperation rather than anything else, with Fernando raising his hand out of the cockpit as he claimed his third Grand Prix win on the trot. Fernando would claim the 2005 World Drivers' Championship when everything was said and done, along with Renault being the Constructors' Champions. Michael and Ferrari would never quite reach the heights of this throughout 2005 again, as there were still a rift of issues underlying with the F2005, even if the stars did align at Imola and the pace could be extracted. Kimi would be the main man to fight for the championship rather than Michael, with the reliability of the MP420 proving to be the prime issue he would face. One of the cases we saw here, with the fragility of his car being just unacceptable at times. Oh yeah, and Jensen got disqualified after the race because BAR decided to try and justify fuel as ballast. Long story short, it didn't work. So Wurz got a podium, which was pretty cool. The main thing I think also that this race demonstrates is that motorsport doesn't explicitly need overtaking to be extremely exciting, as we're always hearing the narrative we need closer racing and more overtaking, etc, etc. But how many times have you seen a car blast past on a straight, whether it be the Kemmel at Spa, or the Hangar straight at Silverstone, or even the back straight at Kota, and the car being overtaken can do absolutely nothing about it. There is a happy medium to overtaking, and it isn't on either extreme, but this race demonstrates that even though it was borderline impossible to overtake, this can still make for an absolutely cracking Grand Prix, and one of my all-time personal favourites.